Hi everyone, and today I'm here to talk about my favourite genre, which is historical fiction. I absolutely love talking about historical fiction and I love conversations about it, so I thought today it would be very enjoyable for myself to make a video about it. I am in no way qualified to give you a lesson on historical fiction, and everything I'm saying is coming from my personal reading experience, and I have done quite a bit of research on the internet before making this video. I've also taken some book examples off my shelves as to books I like and enjoy and would recommend if you want to start reading historical fiction as well. The first thing that I'd absolutely like to stress is there is a difference between historical fiction and historical fantasy, although the lines between them are sometimes very blurred. And the clue is in the name really. Historical fiction is realistic and based on an event, person or setting, and historical fantasy has a fantasy element to it, which borrows from the historical side to provide a world. That might not make any sense, but I'll go back over it again in a minute. Historical fiction is usually taken to be a book that's set in a historic time period before the past 50 years, and it's largely expected that the author will have taken out a reasonable amount of research into the historical period that they want to set their novel in. Things that are usually borrowed from the past are values, norms, fashion, languages, their mannerisms, food, culture, and all of this can be used to build up the world. Now there are many types of historical fiction, and they're usually grouped together first by geography and then by time period. And then you have a whole army of subgenres of historical fiction. Like, all you have to do is look on subgenres of historical fiction on the internet and you can be there for hours. Some of the most popular ones are historical romances, historical mystery, and alternative history. An example of one popular alternative history book is Dominion by C.J. Sansom, which is a book based in London 1952, and the whole idea of the book is what if World War II ended in the opposite direction, if Nazi Germany prevailed over the Allies. And I've not read it yet, but I think it's going to be super interesting, and it's on my spring TBR, but this is an example of historical fiction and alternative history. And from there, that's where you move into the subgenre of historical fantasy, which some people argue isn't a subgenre, but the internet says it is, so I'm just going to say it is in this video. Sometimes you might not even realise that you're reading historical fantasy because the fantasy element is done so well in it. But one absolute perfect example I could give you of historical fantasy is Game of Thrones. George R.R. Martin has invented this world, there's no doubt about that, and it's very heavily epic fantasy, but there is some elements of actual historical fiction in here. Like, George R.R. Martin has done his research into the past when trying to invent his world. For example, I know that for the design of the Gold Cloak's uniform, George R.R. Martin looked at old Japanese uniforms, military ones, to see how he wanted to describe them and create them in his head. So this does come under the genre of historical fantasy also. Another book that I completely overlooked on my shelves when I was looking for historical fantasy books was The Infernal Devices by Cassandra Clare. Cassandra Clare, I really admire for how much research she put into Victorian Britain for this. She really did a lot of work on it, and the setting is very much taken from Victorian Britain, and the norms, the clothes, the values I was talking about again. This all lends itself really well to the steampunk genre, which is a great thing that I love about historical fiction and historical fantasy. They're very multi-genre books. You can pretty much take the setting and do anything with them. Historical fiction can be a great base for any book because with it you can add a layer of romance, you can add a layer of mystery, you can add a layer of whodunit, and that could all be in the same book. It could even be a thriller, it could be any genre, and the whole time you're being given this amazing historical setting. According to my forgotten internet source, the top 5 common periods of historical fiction are Ancient Rome, Early Medieval Europe, the Tudor period and the War of the Roses, the World Wars, and the Great Depression and Jazz Age, and I'm sure everyone can think of at least one book they've read from all of them. If not, you might want to take a trip to the library. Now I'm going to show you some examples of historical fiction on my shelf that I would highly recommend. A really notable historical fiction book that I have is Alone in Berlin by Hans Verlander. This is a book based on a man who is living in Nazi Germany, and he's a one man trying to rebel against the regime on his own. It's actually based on a true story, and at the back, like, I didn't realise this was based on the true story, and then it has a little section with original documents in the back. So yeah, very interesting, heart-wrenching, heartbreaking cry fest of a book. Now I think the majority of people know who Philippa Gregory is by now, considering her books have been made into films, TV shows, you name it. She's getting massive. And her books are an example of historical fiction that has taken a real person that existed in the real setting that did existed, and she's made a book out of it. You've got to remember that these aren't biographies, and she's taken this and put an entertainment spin on it, on what she thinks may have happened in their lives. And she's basing this off some sources, but it's mostly twisted for entertainment, so please take historical fiction with a pinch of salt. Like, this isn't factual. It's called fiction for a reason. If you have not read any Philippa Gregory books, the best ones to read are the Cousins at War trilogy, which are the White Queen, the Red Queen, and the White Princess. Although my personal favourite is the other Boleyn girl, but that becomes quite far down in the chronology. And the Cousins War, I think, starts off with the Lady Rivers, who's the White Queen's mother, and I absolutely love this book. This is probably one of my favourites out of the first of the early books. It's mainly a romance book, to be honest, but I really liked it. Alison May also does the same. Hers are set in the Tudor period. She's taken a real person that actually existed, in this case Elizabeth Tudor, taken the setting and put her own twist on what she thinks happened in her life. At the start of the video, I made a comment about how the lines between historical fantasy and historical fiction are very much blurred, and I found the perfect example of that, okay? The popular Outlander series, of which I have the second book in here in my hand, called Dragonfly in Amber, that's very much on the line between historical fiction and historical fantasy. Right, I hope I get my dates right here. But the fantasy element of this book is that a woman is transported from the 1920s back to Scotland in the early 18th century through some Highland stones. That is literally the only fantasy element of that book. Diana Gabaldon would have had to really research what it was like to live in the 1920s, because that is portrayed, and what it was like to live in Scotland in the early 18th century. She does a really, really good job of that. She's really convincing, and you are totally transported back into that time period, which is what is so great about historical fiction. I don't think a lot of people, when they read this, really realise that they are reading historical fiction. And I really, really love it. It's multi-genre, it also incorporates romance, and I think this is a great book to demonstrate that the lines between historical fiction and historical fantasy can be very, very blurred. And another book is the absolutely memorable Memoirs of a Geisha by Arthur Golden. Real place, real time, borrowed settings, borrowed mannerisms, borrowed situations, and a fictional character. Another good example of historical fiction and romance. So I think that's all I have to say about historical fiction for now. I'll probably make a part 2 later on, but what I want to say really is, when it comes to historical fiction, the possibilities are endless, and it's so interesting because you're kind of getting a history lesson at the same time, but you have to remember, you have to take it with a pinch of salt, and it's just so interesting. It adds another layer to the characters, and to me I just think it makes them really interesting. So really what I just want to say is that the bounds are endless with historical fiction. Well, just think about it yourself. How many time periods has there been? How many ages? How many geographies? How many cultures has there been that you could borrow a setting from in the past? Oh, and I was thought of another one, Sarah Waters as well. She writes romance books and borrows her setting from historical fiction as well. Like, say if you look at your bookshelf right now, I bet there is a hell of a lot of books that borrow environments and context from the past. So yeah, I think that's all I've got to say, so thank you for watching, bye.